So now that you have a better understanding of how to create a table, sometimes we may want to have merged cells in those tables. Now, if you've ever used Microsoft Word or Google Docs or anything, you can very easily merge cells in those software programs just by selecting the cells that you want to merge and then right click and merge, okay? But in HTML, it's a little different because we have to do it with tags, okay? So let's take a look at this example. This is using the Colspan. The column span, by changing that value, it allows us to have a cell that spans over two columns, okay? So let's look at the code that did that. So we had a TR that created the table. We said it's bordered on 1, and then for our first table row, which goes across, everything in that row is spanning over two columns. So we do TD colspan 2 because it spanned two columns, and then whatever text that we want to add. Now for our next table row, we just add content as usual. So we would have a TD, which creates the column 1, and a TD that creates the column 2. Okay? Now, row span works very similarly, so let's take an look at that example code. So we have a table that has a border, and for our first TR is a table row. So let's imagine that there is a line there. This table or this row is containing this. So we'll do TD row span 2 because it's going to take up two rows, and this spans two rows. That's the text that appears there. And then we have a TD for what appears in our next cell, row 1, column 2, okay? Now for our next row, we don't have to include this information because it was already included in the previous row. We only have to include this cell, so TD row 2, column 2, okay? So let's practice that. We're going to make an example that looks like this. So below our Colspan, we're going to use the Colspan to have a name cell that is spanning over two columns, and then we'll also have another column over here. And then later we're going to do a row span that spans over three columns, okay? So let's get started. In your student files, you should have HP 8-2. Yours won't say for video, it'll just say 8-2. And find the first comment that says Code Student Information Table here. So that's right below our Colspan example, and that's where we're going to code this table that has SpongeBob in it. Okay, so we start out by opening a table tag, and again, for the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to add a border just so that we can see where the cells are. Normally, we would need to do this with CSS, but we haven't quite got to the CSS for tables yet, okay? So inside this table, we have a row, okay? So for our first table row, our first cell in that table row is spanning over two columns. So we'll do TD for table data that creates a cell, and we'll say Colspan is 2. It's going to span over two columns. And then what do we want that column to say? The word name. Okay. Now it keeps going. There's another bit to that row. So let's add a TD that says grade. And we could have used THs here. That would have made that bold, and that would have been fine as well. Just for simplicity's sakes, I was just using TDs. Okay, so for our next row, we'll have three cells. We have SpongeBob, SquarePants, and Sophomore. So we'll have TD, SpongeBob, TD, SquarePants, and TD. He's a sophomore. Is he a sophomore? I don't know what grade he's in. Okay, now after that table row ends, let's create a third table row. We have three table rows. And in this one, we also have three cells, so we'll have three TD tags. One for Patrick. Woo! What did I do? One for Starfish. And he's a freshman, right? He acts like a freshman. Okay, so let's refresh and see if our table appears correctly. And it does. Okay, so now let's try using the row span. So scroll down and find your example row span. So code Canna Island Lighthouse here. And we want to code what looks like this. So we have Canna Island Lighthouse that's spanning 3 rows. And then we have 3 rows over here. Okay, so again, we start with our table tag using that border that normally we would do with CSS, but we're cheating a little so that we can see our cells easily. And our first table row is Canna Island Lighthouse and built 1869. So that first table data is Canna Island Lighthouse, and we want it to span over 3 rows. So we do row span 3, and then the text that we want to appear in that cell. And then our next row contains the word built 1869. Okay, now our next row, we don't have to include Canna Island Lighthouse again because we included it up here. All we have to include is automated 1944. So TD automated 1944. And that starts our next row, TR. And the only thing it contains is tower height 65 feet because Canna Island Lighthouse, we already created that. So tower height 65 feet. Okay. Oh, forgot a space. All right, let's refresh it and see if that works. So I'm coming back to that page, refresh, and boom. Hopefully you see how that works out. Just pay attention to your elements, your TRs, your TDs, and even your THs if we had something in bold. Okay?